We're so glad that you're here. My name is Catherine Turcer from Common Cause, Ohio, and I have been worried about dark money. I've been worried about dark money and the inability to actually figure out who is funding things for years. I go back to the whole Watergate follow the money. If we're not actually able to follow the money, it is a real problem. And with that, over the years, we've done some different reports in the state of Ohio looking at money and politics. So before I was at Common Cause Ohio, I was the director of Ohio Citizens Action's Money and Politics Project. And the first report that I did was on the Ohio Supreme Court in the year 2000. And so this has been a long, long road. And we know, that we are living with the consequences every day of dark money. Right now, we have, the continued unveiling of the House Bill 6 scandal. So this is the one where dark money was moved around by the Speaker of the House, and First Energy admitted bribing the chair of the Public Utilities Commission. Basically, they wanted a bailout. First Energy basically wanted all sorts of favorable arrangements. And so, although this specific webinar is going to really deal with the courts, we need to think about this in a broader picture. And so, with that, I think we're ready to move ahead. So, as I said, I'm Catherine Turcer with Common Cause Ohio. I'm just pleased, that the Ohio Fair Courts and Alliance has been coming together for the last few years to talk about kind of the role of money, to really highlight what is going on with the Ohio Supreme Court. And so, first, what we're going to do is, a brief overview of the Ohio Supreme Court and elections and campaign finance. Then I am so pleased. We have an opportunity to hear from Evan Vorpahl. Evan is the senior researcher at True North Research, and he is really focused on the courts. And he's going to go through all of the different findings. He has graphs and charts, and this will be an opportunity to ask all sorts of questions. And then we're going to move from the specifics of the report, which are important, to the big picture, with Lisa Graves, who is the co-founder and executive director of True North Research. You'll notice lots of questions again. And then we're going to talk briefly about getting ready for election 2026. And so, Common Cause Ohio and the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance are so pleased that you're here. And why don't we move along? So I do think it's worth thinking about how we founded Ohio. March 1st is Ohio's birthday. In 1803, you'll notice that the first constitution was 1802. And so before we were a state, we actually established our highest court. And of course, this is the court of last resort. And I think that's important to remember, just how important this court is. I also think, as we're having conversations about 2024 and we're preparing for 2026, it's worth thinking about, how long have we been dealing with the undue influence of money on our fair court, on our court elections, on our Ohio Supreme Court elections. And so the year 2000 was the first year that the Ohio Chamber of Commerce first ran a bunch of different ads. They used the name Citizens for a Strong Ohio at that point. And I think the thing to remember is, in the 90s, there were a couple different decisions. There was the DeRolf decision, which many of us are familiar with. That was a decision that said that the funding for Ohio's election system was unconstitutional. There was also a tort reform decision. And in this case, late 90s, basically the Ohio Supreme Court said, no, you can't actually change things. Actually, courts should be making the decisions. And those two decisions that were seen as anti-business really sparked the Ohio Chamber first go into action. And they have continued to spend time and energy, and it's changed year to year. But this, 2024 was a year where the Ohio Chamber had their fingerprints all over those Ohio Supreme Court races. And so when we're looking at outside money, this kind of long history of a push to get a pro-business court is part of that story. And then, one of the things that I want to remind you all is that, we didn't always have partisan labels on our judicial ballots, and we do now. And so that has really changed how it is people think about the courts and the fairness of the courts. There's a benefit, of course, to better disclosure, but it is a real challenge and has impacted those races and those elections for the past couple cycles. Now, Lisa's going to go into much more detail than I am, but I did think it was important to think about, we have a campaign finance system that is based on what the US Supreme Court has determined. And so this goes back to after Watergate, there was this push to actually try to do something to rein in money and the contribution limits, and they also had spending limits. And spending limits were found to be unconstitutional because they considered money as not speech, but equivalent to speech. It is the gas that makes the engine work. And so I think as we think about how long it is that we have struggled kind of with money and politics and money is speech, it even goes back to that kind of early decision in the 1970s. Also, as we think about why we don't have spending limits, that goes back to that Buckley versus Vallejo decision that said, well, how do you get your message out if you're not spending money? And we can't limit that because it's a limitation of speech. And then as we think about kind of how things progressed, I think it's important to remember the Caperton versus Massey decision, and I would ask Lisa a little bit more about this later on. This is a decision essentially that said that even the contributions that are not given directly to the candidate, even those outside money ones, they can actually influence judges, and judges should be stepping away and recusing themselves from cases of their big financial supporters. And so that becomes complicated in dark money world, which is the next part of the story. So in 2010, you'll remember the Citizens United decision. And with the Citizens United decision, essentially the US Supreme Court said, okay, there is not really a problem with outside groups spending money on political ads because how can it be corrupting? Because it's not coordinated with the candidates. Well, here we are 16 years later, and that seems insane, right? That seems genuinely insane. But that set the stage for corporations having First Amendment rights. And then in a 1-2 punch, we have Speech Now decision, which said, hey, those limitations, the contribution limitations on individuals for things like political action committees, to individuals, that in fact, when it comes to outside groups, hey, it's not constitutional to limit that because there's no coordination with the actual candidate. And so, as we go forward and we have a conversation about what happened in 2024, it's important to remember all of the decisions that were made by federal courts and by the US Supreme Court that set the stage for all of this. And with that, I'm going to hand it. Oh, I was about ready to hand it over, but I did want to remind people of the kinds of ads that we had in 2024. One of the things that I find really appalling about these ads are how many have nothing really to do with what the Ohio Supreme Court primarily does. Most of their time is not spent on criminal justice issues. And yet that is, you would think watching the ads that the Ohio Supreme Court was like Law and Order. And it's one of the things like that really gets at me because it's not in fact one of those things that um, well, it's not one of those things where you're like, oh, this is providing information about the court. It's actually distorting what the Ohio Supreme Court does for many, many Ohioans. And Jessica, you're the next batter up. And this is Jessica Dickinson from the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance.
Everyone, thank you for being with us tonight. Like Catherine said, the Ohio Supreme Court, they decide on all kinds of cases. So we've got two cases here to watch. We have Moe v. Yost, which is about gender affirming care. Um, so what happens here is the Ohio Supreme Court will determine whether Ohio's healthcare freedom constitutional amendment permits a ban on gender affirming care for minors. So in 2024, Ohio passed HB 68, and that was a law banning gender affirming medical care for trans youth. The court is reviewing that appeal to decide if the ban can stand. The arguments will focus on whether healthcare freedom applies to state restrictions on specific treatments. So here that's going to be puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and gender affirming surgery. The healthcare Freedom Amendment was actually enacted in 2011 through an Ohio ballot initiative, and it was designed to prevent government mandates to buy health insurance, but it's now being used to challenge state level bans on specific medical treatments. The 10th District Court of Appeals ruled that restrictions on hormone therapy and puberty blockers for minors violated the state constitution. That means right now, transgender minors can currently receive hormone therapy and medications, but gender affirming surgeries for minors remain banned. The Attorney General Yost, he appealed that decision, the 10th Court of Appeals decision, and to the Supreme Court, and the court is going to hear arguments on March 24th. They're going to, those will be on the Ohio channel at 9 a.m., and we'll put that in our follow-up doc. And then the other case to watch, John Doe versus the City of Columbus. So the City of Columbus wants to enforce ordinances the City Council passed in 2022 that banned high-capacity magazines. It criminalized unsecured guns around children and prohibited selling guns to people who can't legally possess them. Now, despite Ohio being a home rule state, which means cities and municipalities can pass laws on issues like public safety, this case is here in court because the Ohio Revised Code has a preemption law that prevents cities and municipalities from creating their own gun regulations. So the city of Columbus is asking the Ohio Supreme Court to decide whether Ohio cities can create and enforce these local gun laws. And in particular, they're asking the Ohio Supreme Court to decide that Columbus's gun safety ordinance are constitutional. Right now, it's not looking great because the Ohio Supreme Court has previously upheld state preemption laws against similar local gun ordinances. But this case will be decided here in March. They don't have an exact date, but we can keep you updated. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It's worth thinking about all of the important decisions that the Ohio Supreme Court makes. And with that, I'm handing it over to Evan Vorpahl from True North Research to walk us through all the details of the report. So I will be collecting your questions, and Evan, we're going to be ready to ask you a ton of them.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah. So my name is Evan Vorpahl. I direct our state courts research at True North Research. We're a national watchdog group, and we've been following dark money for many, many years. In 2018, we began a project deeply examining groups tied to the Federalist Society co-chair Leonard Leo. And that includes a lot of his state court work. There's been a lot of writing about his influence in impacting the U.S. Supreme Court. But what we found is he's deploying a lot of this money in his network and groups at the state level to really capture state courts across the country. And we certainly saw his influence in Ohio, and we have for a number of years. State courts are often the last defense, protecting Americans' rights, voting rights, worker protections, access to abortion, and more. And we really see wealthy partisan interests increasing their campaign to gain influence over these state courts. It's alarming, and this trend is deepening. We're seeing more, wealthy individuals get involved at the state level, and they're spending more money than ever. As Catherine said, these ads, run by these groups do not reflect what the state Supreme Court actually does in the first place. They rarely rule on criminal cases, but every year these groups roll out millions in ads attacking judges as soft on crime or claiming that judges they support are rule of law judges, which, whatever that means. And every year they're often super misleading, if not outright false at times. And yeah, it's just not great. So I think in Ohio in 2024, each of the six candidates raised around $1 million. This is typically pretty standard for state Supreme Court elections. I think now we're starting to see that number go up a bit, especially in states like Wisconsin, where there's like loopholes where the political party can give like millions to the candidate and then, that just flood the airwaves. But yeah, usually the majority of spending now seems to be coming from outside groups, dark money groups, and these are actually tied to national groups. They're out of state money. So yeah, I think the first group I'm going to talk about. So I guess we saw, the spending largely came from five groups in this election. The first one is the Republican State Leadership Committee's Judicial Fairness Initiative. They spent $1 million. And I'm going to be getting into them a little bit more as I go through. The second one is a group called Ohioans for a Healthy Economy Action. This is a super PAC affiliated with the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. What we discovered doing our research is that Dick Uihlein, an Illinois billionaire who founded the Uihlein Shipping Company, he gave pretty extensively to this group. And he's somebody who also is very invested in state courts. A third group we discovered that was kind of new is Frecka PAC. This is just, a PAC fully funded by an Ohio millionaire named Dave Frecka. He's closely tied to, far-right GOP. He's a mega donor. And they spent $2 million. Ohioans for a Healthy Economy, actually, Ohioans for a Healthy Economy spent $2.5 million, and Frecka PAC spent just over $1 million, but also on an Issue 1 campaign. And then on the sort of like groups backing the Democratic judges, that was largely coming through one group called Ohioans for Judicial Integrity. And this was heavily bankrolled by billionaire Michael Bloomberg. It also had some funding from Ohio progressive groups, as well as the National Redistricting Action Fund. And then a fifth group, really there wasn't a lot of information around them, called Ohioans United for Public Education. We found some ads, but it really wasn't clear how much they spent, and I think it was only just a little bit. So yeah, next slide. So I think the key thing for RSLC, the Republican State Leadership Committee, is they are heavily funded by groups in Leonard Leo's network. The Republican State Leadership Committee is a 527 group. It is a group focused on electing Republican state legislators, but through its Judicial Fairness Initiative, it's been heavily investing in state courts since 2014. RSLC is a group that ran the Red Map Project in 2010, which basically was to capture state legislatures in order to control redistricting and just gerrymander states into oblivion so that they would have permanent majorities. They're a group that has a very partisan agenda and a very regressive agenda. So yeah, RSLC fully funds its Judicial Fairness Initiative. So RSLC reports out its donors. We can see who's funding it. It's hosted by its top funder is Leonard Leo's Concord Fund. It's funded by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's funded by a host of corporations and wealthy individuals. But then RSLC's Judicial Fairness Initiative is fully funded by RSLC. So we can't totally know exactly who's underwriting these judicial ads. But we're pretty certain that Leonard Leo's funding is going for this. Oftentimes, Leo's Concord Fund will give a massive contribution to RSLC. And that day or days later, RSLC will give that money to JFI, which will then run the ads. So it's really just this sort of insane shell game that works to obscure the source of funds. RSLC is one of the top spenders in state elections, not just in Ohio, but across the nation. They spent at least over 30, 35 million in the last 10 years, and they've been sort of the longest running right-wing group spending on state courts. The next group is Ohioans for Healthy Economy Action. Oh yeah, actually, so here you can kind of see a sense of how Leonard Leo kind of like operated in Ohio in 2024. He funds, his group in his network is the Concord Fund, which funds RSLC, which runs ads through GFI. But he has a whole network of other groups, which is we'll talk about, including the Honest Elections Project, Americans for Public Trust, which were running on ads attacking the anti-gerrymandering issue one campaign. Next slide. So yeah, the next group is Ohioans for a Healthy Economy, Inc. and Ohioans for a Healthy Economy Action. This ran $2.5 million in ads, and it was largely funded from Dick Uline's Fair Courts America, which is a super PAC, as well as other chamber funders and a couple other wealthy Ohio like millionaires and billionaires. James and Susan Haslam, who own the Browns. And, as I read, they're trying to get some public financing for their stadium while bankrolling groups are spending millions to, roll back our rights and whatnot. Vivek Ramaswamy. So it's a very right-wing group. We found that Dick Uline's Fair Courts America gave $1 million to the Action Fund to sort of obscure the source of funding. Fair Courts America is led by Andrew Wynn, who used to run RSLC's JFI. So these groups are very sort of like operating on the same agenda. They're close. They use a lot of the same operatives and tactics. Yeah, and these are far right individuals. He celebrated the fall of Roe. They really just want right wing control of the state governments to control gerrymandering. Part of the reason that they're so focused on state courts is that they want judges that are going to rubber stamp their unfair maps. And just lock and control. They do not want fair judges on the bench. Next slide, please. So the last one is Frecka PAC. This one's a little more straightforward. He just funded his super PAC with $2 million, and then it spent just over $1 million on the race. Next slide, please. So yeah. Oh, I guess like one more thing on Frecka too. He was sort of a newer player in this, and I thought he was kind of funny. Um, he had like a plastics manufacturing firm, but looking into him, it was like he had a website where he talked about his fleet of supercars. He called himself Big Daddy Dave, which I thought was kind of strange. Yeah, and he owns like a castle outside of Columbus, Ohio. So I think that really underscores the point of like these are not normal people. They're not people who are like us. They do not have the same interests as us. They have millions, if not billions of dollars, like at their disposal to run this money, to run these campaigns. Yeah, and they've certainly sort of targeted Ohio in other ways too. Another group in Leo's network called the Honest Elections Project is a legal alias of one of his other groups. But they've targeted Ohio. They basically were behind the model bill that banned so-called foreign funding of ballot measures in Ohio, even though it was something that was already prohibited, which was sort of a workaround way to limit direct democracy and try to sink the anti-gerrymandering initiative. This group itself was a dark money group, and its model bill did nothing to sort of advance disclosure of dark money groups and 501c4s. And Uline himself was massively behind other ballot measures that would make it harder for people to amend the Constitution and, was against the abortion ballot measure. Yeah, so with that, I'll pass it over to Lisa to talk about the bigger picture.
So this is Lisa Graves. I noticed a little love in the chat for Lisa. She is the co-founder and executive director of True North Research, and we're just really pleased that you're here, Lisa.
Gosh, thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you, Jessica. And thank you to Evan, who I've been working with now for 10 years on these issues. He's our director of state courts and democracy. And it was he and I put that slide deck together. It was nice to see nice to see it. We don't often bring those slides out into the public, but we're really thrilled to see so much action and interest by the community to learn about how to track the dark money, how to respond, how to deal with this surge. And I also want to thank Mia and Kelly for their behind the scenes tech support for this work. And now I'm going to do something really quickly before I actually jump into the substance, which is to say, wow, it's Columbus and Cincinnati and Bluffton and Mount Vernon, Dayton, Pataskala, Powell, Mentor, Merriam, Grandview Heights, Beaver Creek, Hilliard, Youngstown, Lebanon, Bay Village, Kettering, Olmsted. Wow, I still got more. Huber, Findlay, Lewis, Center, Cleveland Heights, Quaker Heights, Akron, Cedarville, Westerville, Ridgeview, Groundville, Crestline. What an amazing turnout of incredible, devoted Ohioans. Thank you so much for taking your Wednesday night to come out to support this meeting with Common Cause Ohio and with Fair Courts Ohio. Really, really deep appreciation to you all, both for being here now and for what that signifies about your devotion to your state and to our country and to our future. So, Evan teed up this first slide for me, which, oh, go back. Sorry, which is what's at stake? Everything. Uh, I didn't make this slide. I did make it, so I know what's on it. Voting and climate change and abortion and schools and justice and fairness and pollution and anti-corruption. Everything is at stake. And the Ohio Supreme Court, given the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, has been captured by Leonard Leo and his billionaire backers, and the U.S. Supreme Court only takes about 60 to 70 actual cases a year, although it now is issuing a substantial number of so-called emergency shadow docket orders. And so a lot of these issues that we are facing, that you're facing, are going to be decided by the Ohio Supreme Court, not necessarily the U.S. Supreme Court. And so there, of course, has been a corresponding effort to capture the Ohio Supreme Court, which is why the Republican-controlled legislature with a Republican governor, who I used to sit across the aisle from when I was the chief counsel for nominations for the Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Patrick Leahy, when Senator Mike DeWine was in the Senate, I was appalled to see him sign those measures and other measures into law. He seems like a nice guy in person. His policies, I think, are deeply, deeply destructive. And one of the most destructive policies in terms of court fairness was him and his fellow Republicans deciding to add partisan labels to the Ohio Supreme Court races in order to try to game the system so that people would vote on a party line vote, not based on merits, not based on the merit, not based on the record, in my view, of those justices, but in order to try to tip the balance in favor of Republicans, as Ohio has been inundated with this sort of rising right-wing set of policymakers who have really been determined to use the Democratic power and the non-democratic power, meaning the court power, in order to take away people's rights, to limit people's rights, in my view. That's my opinion. So we'll go to the next slide. As Evan said, one of the key people in these fights in Ohio is a guy who is not from Ohio. Now, to be fair, I too am not from Ohio, but I'm not injecting millions of dollars in to change the rights of Ohioans. And that's what Leonard Leo has sought to do. So I made this little map of him. He was a longtime vice president of the Federal Society. The Federal Society is a group that was created in 1982 in order to create a pipeline to power of sort of Reagan Republicans, Reagan activists, Reagan revolutionaries to get control of levers of power in the states and in the federal government. That's a picture of Leo in the middle. To the right, I used to have this question mark over there where Barry Side's head is, because we didn't know who it was, although I suspected it was Barry Side, who was really funding Leonard Leo. It was like this big question mark, not Marble Freedom Trust. But then we learned in 2022 that a super rich billionaire, also not from Ohio, a guy named Barry Side from Chicago, who got rich selling us all power cords for our computers, decided that he was going to give Leonard Leo not just $1.6 million, but $1.6 billion, making him a billionaire by virtue of the trust that he controls, meaning a legal trust, not actual human trust, but a legal entity called the Marble Freedom Trust. And that becomes the vehicle for Leonard Leo moving $100 million to $200 million a year over the past 5 years into both C4, which are advocacy groups, and C3 nonprofits to change American culture. And Leonard Leo has said he was previously much more behind the scenes. We helped drag him into the spotlight. Since he's been having to face some public scrutiny, he's been very emboldened in his extreme statements, claiming that he wants to weaponize the nonprofit sector to attack progressive values. And so that's what he's been doing. This money comes from Moral Freedom Trust. It goes into things that we call DAFs, not because they're daffy, but because they're donor advised funds. DAFs are things that are designed specifically to hide from you who's really funding stuff. So when you look at the financial filings of Moral Freedom Trust, they have to disclose who they give money to. So they say, oh, they give it to these groups: Rule of Law Trust, Donors Trust, Schwab. Schwab now has another name. And then those groups give money to core Leo groups like Concord Fund, which also goes by Judicial Crisis Network, and recently sort of closed down that name because it's all a disposable name. It's all just like a front group name. They have a new name that they're, starting to put forward this year in the 2026 election cycle. Then some of that money goes into this thing as Leo, oh my goodness, Evan, I called you Leo for a second there. As Evan mentioned, Leo gets that money into RSLC. RSLC created a thing called the Judicial Fairness Initiative. It's a nice name. I think that it's not really about fairness at all. It's about Republican domination of the state courts, partisan domination of state courts. And the whole purpose of the, quote, Judicial Fairness Initiative is to make it so that RSLC is the only publicly disclosed donor. So when you look at who's funding the Judicial Fairness Initiative, it's not listing Leonard Leo's groups, the groups that he's most closely tied to, like Concord or JCN. It lists RSLC. So it sort of is another way of washing through the money trail to try to make it hard to follow. And then, of course, that money is coming to a court near you, including Supreme Court races in Ohio. As Evan mentioned, in the recent cycles, the candidates themselves have raised perhaps about $1 million. But what we're seeing in Ohio races around the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, as well as other issues like the anti-gerrymandering issue, the protection of abortion access for women in Ohio, women and girls in Ohio, those faced a surge in money that exceeded the amount of money that basically goes to a candidate. It's a huge money that's going into these outside groups. And we help trace how much of that money coming in to try to limit abortion access in Ohio was really the originator was Leonard Leo, Leonard Leo, Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo is someone who has deeply held personal religious beliefs. He's entitled to them. In my view, what he's not entitled to do is to impose his religious beliefs on other people as a matter of law. I don't think anyone has that right in a free society. And that's not all. Leonard Leo also opposes gay rights, gay marriage. He has long worked with Charles Koch on anti-regulation measures. And oh, of course, by the way, so was Barry Seid, working with Charles Koch at one of his flagship groups, and also working with Charles Koch through Leonard Leo to create the Antonin Scalia Law School just outside DC in honor of one of the most regressive justices ever to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Yeah, this is Barry Seid. I did commission this editorial cartoon of him because there's only 3 known photos of him, basically, that are in the public domain. And I really wanted to expose like how his money is just spewed out into the world. When I started looking into Barry Seid several years ago, one of the things I discovered through our research involving the Bradley Foundation and other work was that Barry Seid had secretly underwritten briefs to the U.S. Supreme Court on behalf of state attorneys general. He also has a history of using secret arrangements to bankroll controversial right-wing religious agendas. He has claimed that this is not so, but there's a paper trail. You can follow it. Meanwhile, as I said, Leo has been the architect of this dark money that's been engulfing the U.S. Supreme Court and also state elections, trying to overturn Roe, trying to make it harder to vote. And on the making it harder to vote, as Evan mentioned, one of the disposable front groups that Leonard Leo has helped spawn is a thing that calls itself the Honest Elections Project. I call it HEP because I don't think it's about honest elections. It's about basically making Donald Trump's January 6th speech, not the inciting the riot part, but the other part of the equation when he was talking about all the ways he wanted state laws changed to make it harder for Americans to vote. That's what HEP and HEP Action have been up to over the last 5 years, is trying to operationalize Donald Trump's big lie about the election and about stolen elections, about voter fraud. This isn't evidence. It's been debunked over and over and over again. But Leo has gone to work to try to cleanse that, wash that through this thing that he and his buddies have dubbed the Honest Elections Project. And they've also worked to limit our ability to mitigate climate change and more. Next slide. Oh, yes. Now I made this image of Barry Side because, again, there was only one or two images of him, and I really thought of him as the Monopoly Man because, that's my vintage Monopoly. And so I made this little image of him as the Monopoly Man because he's super rich and he's in his 90s now, and he has basically given Leonard Leo this fortune to try to made him into $1 billion trust fund, baby. I made that slide in order to basically change our legal culture to advance this very regressive view. Before I wrap this section, I'm just going to add a couple of notes on the big picture. First on the sort of background, and then second on the kind of forward-looking piece. So first, as Catherine said, Buckley versus Leo was the decision in 1976 that allowed a lot of money to be spent, on campaigns for office. And that ruling came in the aftermath of Congress making some really serious reforms to the election law in the Federal Election Campaign Act, FECA, which replaced a previous law that had a much better name, the Federal Corruption Act, because it's about corruption. And Ohioans, wow, I mean, this thing firsthand. You have seen corruption. It's been documented, it's been investigated, it has been prosecuted, and has involved powerful corporations and powerful politicians at the highest levels, basically trading money for favors. So that decision, that Buckley decision, which basically said you could spend as much money as you want on a campaign, or a campaign could spend as much money, it's still left in place limits on how much a particular individual or a PAC could give to a candidate, with one exception. The exception was for self-funding a campaign. And it just so happens that I helped document the previously unknown fact that it was Charles Koch who bankrolled that litigation. Charles Koch, before you ever heard of him, before he ever became a famous oil baron, billionaire, there he was underwriting the litigation to say that you can self-fund your own campaign. And then what happened next is his brother self-funded his own campaign for vice president in the 1980 election against Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. He was the vice presidential candidate, spent more money himself than anyone had ever spent themselves on a campaign, and lost, was soundly rejected, got less than 1% of the vote. So there are Koch origins there. Then fast forward to the Citizens United decision, which really should be called Billionaires United. That was a case brought by a group that got its start early days, helping to push Clarence Thomas onto the bench despite Anita Hill's testimony against him and his thoroughly regressive point of view and his lack of actual experience as a nearly just barely 40-year-old for a lifetime seat on our Supreme Court that he has now sat on for almost 45 years, issuing destructive opinion after destructive opinion. That ruling in Citizens United went further than Buckley in suggesting that money is speech and therefore cannot be regulated. Clarence Thomas said, oh, by the way, not only should it not be regulated, these outside groups should be able to spend unlimited money, but he also claimed that if money is speech, you can't do anything to chill speech by disclosure. Clarence Thomas said that, wrote that concurring opinion, even though he certainly knew that his wife had just received $500,000 from none other than Harlan Crow, the Nazi memorabilia collector that we would later learn of. Harlan Crow had staked Ginny's effort to create a nonprofit to take advantage of the decision to come in Citizens United. She got that $500,000 from their benefactor, the person who's been underwriting their lifestyle of luxury. Clarence Thomas did not recuse himself from that case. He sat on it. It was a 5-4 decision. If he had recused, it would have been 4-4, and the lower court ruling would have stood and our bipartisan campaign reform acts would have stood, but that decision was inherently corrupt. It was corrupted by Clarence Thomas. Caperton, just to conclude that part, is a decision that came out of West Virginia. As Catherine said, it talked about how a justice couldn't sit on a case if someone had given that justice millions of dollars to run. West Virginia had been a little bit of the Wild West in terms of the money coming into a judicial election. The West Virginia Supreme Court refused to recuse the guy who got the money from Massey, from the coal baron. Didn't recuse, didn't recuse, didn't recuse. Oh, and they ruled in his favor. Imagine that. So the U.S. Supreme Court said, hey, actually, that's a violation of due process to have a judge who's received huge money from a party to a case. You shouldn't do that. And so that decision came down. It was a Justice Kennedy decision. Also, who dissented? John Roberts and Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. Oh, and of course, Antonin Scalia, who was on the gravy train of trips and luxury travel before we learned about it with Clarence Thomas. So now we have a court that has not actually enforced Caperton in the succeeding years and has in fact suggested at the U.S. Supreme Court level that they're not bound, they're not required to follow federal ethics rules, that they can make up their own rules, rules that are lower than for any other court in the country. So the second part is all of this matters. It's extremely hard to follow the money. It's not impossible. You can follow the breadcrumbs. You can say what's knowable. You can say what's not knowable. You can raise questions. You can talk about who's giving the money, like Jimmy and Dee Haslam. I only knew of them because of the Cleveland Browns ownership. But when I looked in, I was like, oh, wow. His company, the company he led with his fellow executives, was subject to a $56 million settlement for defrauding truckers and customers in Ohio and across the country. He settled that case, but that's still part of his history. And when money's coming in from the Haslams, I think every newspaper and every blogger has an obligation to say not just that they own this great team we love, but also they have this other track record. And what do they want from the court? What is their return on investment? What is the return on investment from Bill Frecka or whatever his name is, Frecka, and his plastics company, which is really built on the oil industry. Plastics are a byproduct of the oil industry. What does Frecka want on his return on investment? Can someone like Frecka, who I don't know from Adam, maybe a perfectly nice dad, father, brother, neighbor, I don't know, but I don't think someone who's living in a 25,000 square foot house can relate to me and the interests of other ordinary people who are working class people who just want a fair shake at the Supreme Court. So this matters a lot. We really appreciate your tuning in, and I will conclude my a little bit long opening comments. Thank you for indulging me.
Well, we are always very glad to indulge you. And so, one of the things I'd like to do now is ask you and Evan a few questions. I think the first question that I have, Lisa, really comes down to this. The U.S. Supreme Court, when they decided Citizens United, they took a vote about disclosure and the benefit of disclosure. And as you highlighted, Clarence Thomas was not on board with disclosure. Um, we had an opportunity actually to have transparency in our campaign finance system, including outside money. But that's not what happened, and it's just gone on and on and on, and now we're year 16. Um, how do you think about this, and why haven't we managed to do something after all of the call for shining a light on this money? Oh, you need to come off mute.
I'll say two things and then defer to Evan. The first is that Justice Kennedy, in that opinion, assumed there would be disclosure. That was an error in his judgment. He asserted that this money was not powerful because it wasn't coordinated with the candidates, and that it would be disclosed. So people would be able to see the money, and it was of little, quote, little value if it could not be controlled by the party. But everyone knows how this works. The buddy of the party, the candidate, goes out and runs the outside group. They don't talk about what they're going to do. They're just, kind of on an ESP level aligned in attacking their opponent, because most of the money goes into attack ads. And that's actually perfect for the candidates because they get to deny that they had anything to do with those attack ads, but they benefit enormously from having someone else get their hands dirty attacking their opponents. But the second part is there's a lot of pox on both their houses, against the Democrats and the Republicans for both spending this outside money. But the fact is that in my personal opinion, the Democrats cannot unilaterally disarm in this environment. But what they've done, certainly in Congress consistently, is try to move forward a bare minimum disclosure rule that would get this money out into the open, not stop it. I would prefer it to be stopped, but just to get it disclosed. And at every single juncture in every state where it's come up, and certainly in Congress, it has been Republicans almost unanimously, certainly in Congress, unanimously blocking efforts to disclose because they do not want you to know how few the number of billionaires, although there are too many of them, but how a few people are really dictating policy. Democrats would vote for those disclosure bills if they ever, if they have a chance. We may see that happen in some near future or far future. But if you care about dark money, we have to continue to push for overturning Citizens United and for disclosure in the meantime. Evan, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, it really is unpopular on no matter where you are on the political spectrum. Like, people don't want corporations spending and packing the courts, or, they don't want elected officials who are beholden to corporations, wealthy individuals. Conservative voters don't like this. And what we've seen is like where there is more disclosure in these races, like people do not like it. People don't support these candidates. We've seen in, traditionally states that elect heavily Republicans, there'll be Republicans who get hammered on this when they're sort of like labeled as these dark money candidates. Like people across the spectrum do not want this money, and disclosure, I think, goes a long way here, and it's really helpful. And in Ohio, it's very hard to track the money. There's not a lot of disclosure, and that makes it incredibly difficult. And like it's easy to trick voters that way.
Yeah, I mean, and I tell Catherine all the time that I wish I could run an ad after every ad saying, "Do you know who that really is? We don't know. Don't you think you should know?" And in fact, Catherine and Jessica and Evan, along with some journalists, worked on a project, Judge the Judges or Judge the Ads, which I really encourage you to take a look at, where they were attempting to try to create the record that people could have those conversations.
Well, I'm actually really proud of that project, and it's well worth thinking about. Well, if you can't stop the dark money, is there a way to give people the tools so that they look at the ads and they're able to say, okay, well, wait a second, what exactly is going on here? Because it is incredibly complicated. I know for like I think about like the House Bill 6 scheme, you have one entity giving to another entity. And for example, their text messages, this would have been election 2018, where the governor basically texts the CEO, this is the former CEO of First Energy, saying, hey, Cordray got $1 million from OEA, Ohio Education Association. Hey, I need some more money. And essentially, after, you through text chains, you can see that afterwards, the CEO talks to the lobbyist. The lobbyist says, "Okay, we'll spend, half $1 million, not to the Republican Governors Association, but to their affiliate called State Solutions." And I think one of the things that happens is there's so many different entities, and we can feel like, hey, what do we do with all of this? And how do we use this to like talk to voters, or like what do we do with this?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, for one, I think it's helpful when you look at these groups to really like it seems like an alphabet soup, and they move money from one group to the other, and it's this huge shell game. But in reality, like we kind of laid out, it's often just one person or a couple people behind this. And I think like making that clear and really connecting those dots is helpful for people to understand, like, look, this is a national agenda. It's coming from a few people with a lot of money. And this is what they want. This is why they're trying to capture this seat. It's overwhelming when you try to like look at, the shell game of groups and all the ways they're attacking it. But in reality, like these are just a few people. What they want is not popular, and they're rigging the rules in their favor in order to let their money outweigh our voices. And I think like as long as people can understand and see what's going on, like what we support things that most people want. What we want is popular, and I think That's one key takeaway.
Mhm. So one of the questions we really had that I thought was interesting was, are there good model bills for disclosure, that we could be promoting, at the state level, possibly the city level? Are there models for that kind of disclosure that you think would be useful?
I think there are, and there are definitely some states that have tried to pursue some efforts to make sure, like, so for example, to the extent that a corporation itself cannot donate, but then the CEOs are, or their PACs are, it's, there are a set of rules that sort of differ by state.
Mhm.
Definitely would defer to Common Cause Ohio, about those measures, like what would be the vehicle to go forward. I do know that after Citizens United, I worked on an effort alongside other groups like Reclaim Democracy and Public Citizen to try to get resolutions about overturning
Mhm.
Citizens United. So to build that groundswell of support. At one point, there were constitutional amendments. Bernie Sanders and others put forward amendments to overturn it. During the Democratic control of the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi, there was House Bill 1, which
Mhm.
included a significant set of measures to overturn Citizens United, in particular to get the disclosure forward. And it's not disclosing everyone who gave $5, but if you gave a significant amount, then you had to disclose that amount. And so those measures are certainly worth looking to. And also, I just think we need to think bigger overall and think about like not just clawing back to the kind of the tattered remains of some of these oversight rules, but actually invigorate an even broader set of reforms. We clearly need it. Corruption is on the rise, as we see at the federal government level, and in the states. And we clearly need better rules, stronger enforcement mechanisms, more money to go into protecting public
Mhm.
integrity in our elections, more money to protect our elections from being distorted, more oversight by the FCC that isn't about, some loyalists putting their thumb on the scale in favor of the president, but that
Mhm.
actually gets more disclosure of the ad spending in our states, both on, TV stations and also through social media. So there's a lot of reforms that are necessary. And I just think we have to have at the base level, without a particular bill, just a
Mhm.
basic conversation with our fellow Americans, our fellow, in your case, Ohioans, like this
Mhm.
system is not working. We have to fix it. We have to fix it to get our voices heard.
Well, and I noticed that Sandy threw in basically move to amend. Let's actually amend the Constitution. Let's not
Yes.
think small. Let's amend the U.S. Constitution. She also mentioned corporate personhood, which made me think about the Montana plan. And I noticed Tina there mentioned the Montana plan. Um, I found that completely fascinating. So
Yep.
basically, the Montana plan, as opposed to thinking about changing the US Constitution, they're thinking about, well, if this is about corporations and they're artificial persons, right? And they're given their rights by the state. Well, why don't we just take away their right to participate broadly in elections? What do you think about that idea, Lisa?
Well, first of all, I was going to say I helped found Move to Amend early days in response to Citizens United and help support the efforts to get those city and
Mhm.
county resolutions at the grassroots level of people really saying, hey, it's not okay, let's get this amended. I also think that uh, there's a new book coming out from Tom Hartman. I just wrote a blurb for it about this issue. It's a book about corporate rights and the invention of corporate rights by a previously sort of decrepit U.S. Supreme Court going back 150 years ago,
Mhm.
trying to inject corporate rights that, were not part of the founding generation's approach to rights. The corporations are creations on paper by people, by governments.
Mhm.
They used to have limited charters, meaning that they couldn't live forever. They weren't eternal. They had to have their charters renewed. And it would have been a complete shock to the founding generation that
Mhm.
corporations have grown in so much power. And I don't think they should have that power. We're a democracy, not a corporatocracy. We're not
Mhm.
a dollarocracy, or we shouldn't be a dollarocracy. And corporations, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit corporations, should not be playing this extraordinary role in our elections where only
Mhm.
human beings can vote. But I also don't think that any human being should be able to spend an unlimited amount of money on elections, whether it's their own election. I reject Buckley versus
Mhm.
Vallejo on that point, or someone else's election. I think there should be caps. I think there should be public financing. There was a big movement on public financing elections that the
Mhm.
Republicans have attacked relentlessly in Wisconsin, where I am, and other states. And I think we need really broad reforms, like what's being attempted in Montana or has been attempted in Montana and other places. We just need to be thinking big and boldly about what would fix it, and not just nibble at the edges, not just try to put band-aids on this. I think, may have an opportunity to reconsider a lot of things in the aftermath of the ongoing disaster that we're seeing every single day on the news, and we should take advantage of it. We should think big.
Well, on that note, we are almost at 7 o'clock. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Mia to throw up a slide. I'm going to say thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Evan. We just really appreciated hearing from you. And one of the things that we wanted to do is, as we said goodbye, is just remind everybody there have been some changes in election administration behind the scenes. And so I want to encourage you all to, basically check your voter registration, make sure you're not in confirmation stage status, because what happens is that the voter rolls are being cross-referenced with other databases, and that, basically to ensure that non-citizens are not voting. But what that means is many of us may be sent into confirmation status and not be aware of it, because what do we know about what's in different databases? And databases, like humans, can be incorrect. So make sure you're checking, and get ready for that May primary. And then I talked about this a little bit earlier about, you know, we should be thinking big. We should be thinking about amending the Constitution. We should be thinking about what are the things so that we have a truly robust democracy. But in the meantime, we can all look at those ads. We can all look and see, okay, who is paying for this? What do they want? Is this a scare tactic? And we can encourage other voters to really look to see who is actually paying for the ads. And then I also want to encourage us to get to know the candidates. And then, we'll send you follow-up information, including a recording, and we'll send you the slides. But we also want you to be part of our Ohio Fair Courts Alliance team, because let's face it, it's going to take a lot of us to get fair courts. And with that, any final words that you'd like to say, Lisa?
I'll just say thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Evan, my partner in this work. And thank you to Jessica, and again to the behind the scenes crew, Mia and Kelly. Thank you all for coming tonight, and look forward to continuing this work with you all. Thanks, everyone.
Well, and we hope to have you back sometime soon to talk about all things democracy.
Yes, Evan and I would be happy to come back.
All
Thanks,
right,
Evan.
thank you,
Thank you.
everybody. We're glad you were able to join us. And I have to say, Lisa, when you read the list of all the places, thank you, everybody. We're just so glad you were able to join us this evening. And we'll touch base really soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.